Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. And this is also a podcast on anchor.fm and on Apple Podcasts called Chaos, C-A-O-S. So in this video and this podcast, I want to talk about the idea that conflict resolution doesn't need agreement. But it may be a side effect or an outcome of conflict resolution, but it's not a requirement for conflict resolution. And the reason that I want to explore that is because quite often there is this almost pressurized feeling that in order to move forward in a conflict situation, there has to be agreement. And that exists quite a lot within mediators as well, who I think sometimes perhaps bring their own expectations about conflict into their mediation practice. And really the point of mediation practice is that you remain open to whatever it is that people want to create for themselves in their given situation. And so perhaps some mediators bring their own perhaps unquestioned agenda that an outcome of this mediation has got to be that people agree to something. And I want to try to go through today many of the reasons why it doesn't in itself anyway represent conflict resolution, but as I've said, it may be a side effect of resolving conflicts, but it's not a necessary thing for conflict resolution. And perhaps try to indicate some of the many ways in which I mean that, and show why the sense that there's a pressure to agree in some situations rather than resolve conflict. So I want to try to kind of outline what I mean by the difference between the two. That pressure to agree is one of the things that actually can make a situation worse. It can mean, in the case of mediation, people not even engaging in mediation because they think they're going to be made to agree to something, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, but people can sometimes kind of have that view that there's going to be kind of all this pressure on them to compromise, is another word, say that they'll agree to something that they're not happy with, etc., etc. So they get this kind of misconception of what mediation's about, and I think very often that's because they're bringing their own understanding of conflict resolution as meaning agreement, and sometimes there's a risk, obviously, that the mediator themselves doesn't make clear that distinction because perhaps they haven't themselves considered the distinction between the two. So that's what I want to explore today. I'm going to go through some kind of different examples of that as we talk through. So the first thing I would say is to, in a sense, just to start with ourselves, just to consider whether, if you think of someone that you get on well with, whether it's actually true that with that person you agree with everything about how they see the world, how they do things, their behaviors, their actions, and that you agree with all those things before it means you can have a good relationship with them. And I'm pretty sure you're going to say, no, that's not a requirement. And so in a sense, just from our own experience, it's pretty clear that unless you disagree with me, in which case the rest of the video may not make sense to you, but I think most people will come to see that people that we actually relate well with, whether at work or in personal relationships, or our partner or our kids or whoever, we can actually have a very good, thriving, productive, engaging, intimate perhaps, with our partner's relationship with people without it there being a requirement that we agree on everything. That actually sometimes our disagreements can be quite inspiring, quite creative, quite enlightening, but I don't want to mean that in the way that sometimes enlightenment is discussed. We're not going to be floating 5 inches off the ground as a consequence, but awareness raising, because we get to hear another person's perspective, but we don't fall out over it. We actually acknowledge and what I call respectfully and creatively disagree with people. So it is this idea that what conflict resolution has got to be indicated by is agreement that I'm wanting to kind of challenge today. And I want to challenge it on the basis of the fact that, when I provide mediation, it just isn't what people are always looking for. Now, I don't want there to be any perception from what I'm saying, as sometimes people take me as meaning here, that there shouldn't be agreement. So I'm not saying agreement is bad, I'm just saying it's not necessary for conflict resolution. If people want an agreement, they will of their own volition create it. And in many ways, it can only be if it's created of their own volition. You can't have agreement forced on someone. It doesn't make sense. But in some ways, that's what I want to kind of explore in relation to just conflict resolution in general, but also within the practice of mediation. Because if mediators have a belief that they've got to get an agreement, and this is actually quite commonplace, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but if mediators bring that expectation, it actually becomes very pressurized for people, because instead of people being given the free space to kind of have a useful and creative discussion about their difficulties, there's this mediator kind of sitting in the background constantly saying, well, do you want to write that down? Have you agreed on something? Shall we say that's an agreement? And it's like, it's so unnecessary. It's not necessary. If people want to agree, so long as they're clear that that's a possible thing for them to create within the meeting, they will decide if that's a necessary thing for them to move forward. So as I say, for me, it's aligned with the idea that people create what they want in mediation, and that can include mediation, but it may not. So therefore, if a mediator is always framing the process as being about coming to agreement, it's placing an unnecessary pressure on people beforehand. And during, if they kind of practice in that way. And the thing is, it's kind of overlooking what that then misses for people, that actually, instead of there being this kind of constant pressure to come to agreement, and get it all written down and maybe even signed and witnessed and any of that stuff, it's meaning people are not getting the opportunity to genuinely come to an understanding of each other, which is what leads to conflict resolution, an understanding that actually what we think about the other person, particularly in conflicts where people have been kept separate or have separated themselves because they don't want to engage with the person, that often their beliefs about the other person are different to how they actually are, and it gives people an opportunity to hear that. So many mediations that I do, and as I say, I also want to talk in a minute about outside of the mediation context, because it's any of these beliefs that we have within ourselves that there has to be agreement over things. But many mediations that I've provided have meant that people have perhaps not engaged with each other in any sense at all, maybe for a year or more sometimes, or they haven't anyway, because one person's an official in an organisation and the other person's a complainant, and they've never had a chance to meet. But in things like workplace disputes, family disputes, people have engaged, but then there's been a falling out of some sense. Sometimes they then haven't interacted for some time, or if they have, it's been an argument, etc., which has felt very stressful and difficult. And through mediation and the different kind of aspects about that are designed to promote there being a constructive and useful discussion, they've been able to explore in kind of quite a lot of detail what has led to each person saying or doing certain things, and they've been given a chance to understand that thing differently, that behavior or that action or that event or that phrase, understand it differently, that actually perhaps it wasn't meant in a malicious way. It might have been said in a moment of anger, but it doesn't necessarily mean as the same as the other person's interpreted it. And I want to try to give examples as we go through. So the one that kind of comes to mind at the moment when I say that is I once did a workplace dispute mediation between two people, and they hadn't actually engaged for about, I think it was over a year. It could have been as long as 15 months. And they didn't always work together, but on certain projects at a particular time of the year, they needed to engage with each other, and one person had kind of shut off contact because they were perhaps so upset by the behaviour of the other person. It was where there was an allegation of bullying in the way that the other person had acted towards them. And the person who was concerned about the other person's, well, they were both concerned about each other's behaviour, but the person who had suggested it was bullying was very reticent at first to even come to the meeting. But I explained, there's no pressure to decide anything. If you want to leave at any time, you're free to do so. There'll be a very dedicated space in which you'll be listened to, and also that you'll listen to the other person. So there are different things that I think in time reassured them that it was worth at least turning up to, even if they decided to leave after 15 minutes. But actually they did stay in the meeting for the full 3 hours, which is how long the mediations that I run usually are. And you could say at the end of the meeting there was nothing that was decided, nothing was clarified, because there certainly wasn't any agreement anyway, and there'd been various kind of viewpoints expressed about what one had done and what the other one had done, etc., etc. But just the very act of being in the room together for 3 hours was very symbolic to both of them, because it showed that they could have a passionate, useful discussion for that length of time, when before they barely even wanted to interact with each other because of the difficulties. So just that event in itself, that opportunity to see it is possible for me to have a conversation with this person, even though I disagree with them, even though I don't like some of the things they've done. I've now told them the things I didn't like what they've done. I didn't like the way they did it. I felt belittled by it. I felt humiliated by it. I felt they were undermining me. They've had the chance to say all these things to each other and stay in the room for 3 hours. Now, there's no agreement involved in that, but there is that opportunity to understand and hear and see that it's possible to interact with this person without it all falling apart. So they were able to move to being able to as I describe it, respectfully and creatively disagree. And what then happened was they actually did in time decide to come back for a second meeting. Now that second meeting was very, very different. They actually turned up together. They talked through some changes that had happened both in their working relationship but also personally for them as a consequence of that last meeting. The second meeting only lasted about an hour and a half because they had very little still to discuss after that time, even though I was looking at, what are your thoughts about if it might happen again? How would you deal with it? And they came to clear ideas about how that was going to be possible, but there was no agreement. It was just, no, we're fine now. We know that we can interact with each other. We know we can talk. We know that if there's a problem, we'll be able to raise it with each other without it being a problem. And that's all that happened. Nothing written down whatsoever. No agreements. Just a clarity that they can now communicate without it all having to be defined on a piece of paper, listed as bullet points or a flow chart or anything like that. None of that needed, as none of us ever do need when we interact with people that we can relate to effectively, whether as friends or colleagues. So that's just one example of what I mean, and I hope to kind of include other examples as I go through. So I'm aware that in quite a few mediation organisations or services, the mediator is expected to kind of give an outcome assessment of the meeting, and that outcome assessment often will be settlement reached, partial settlement reached, no settlement reached. Now, I mean that's very much a kind of a carryover from the legal framework, which, as many of you will know, I often see many, what I would say, kind of incongruencies between features like that in some mediation practices and the fact that mediation is nothing like the legal process. So this idea that there needs to be settlement, partial settlement or no settlement, as if that's a kind of a hierarchy of success levels, is one of the many things that I would challenge about some mediation practices, and also some of the influences that come from an entirely different process, i.e. a legal process, an adversarial process, into a cooperative non-adversarial process. And that's very much kind of featured when you have those kinds of assessments as outcomes, because really, in a sense, you'd have to say, in that workplace dispute, which was very clearly something that had been resolved in the eyes of the participants, had been able to move forward in a way that meant that what I describe as dissolved, the conflict had dissolved, and I'll say a bit about that in a second. But the this thing about mediation outcomes being measured as whether settlement has been reached, partial settlement has been reached, or no settlement has been reached, well, that situation would have been no settlement reached. So where those assessments are used to measure the success of mediation, that would have been categorized as no success. But actually it was entirely successful, because it was a participant-led, created outcome that worked for them, such that they weren't even feeling in conflict when they came for the second meeting. They'd shared all sorts of things with each other independently, and in that meeting, in the second meeting, that made clear that they had a different understanding of each other. They'd come to different understandings of themselves and how they'd behave towards each other. They had new clarities about what was working in the past and what wasn't. They didn't need to write it down because they knew how to take it forward. So there's no settlement reached. But in the eyes of these measurements of mediation outcomes as settlement, partial settlement, no settlement, it's very much this kind of need to kind of fix and control things, rather than trust that actually people are able to work these things out by themselves without it all having to be documented. Because the proof is in the pudding kind of thing. If after the mediation they're still having these difficulties, then it hasn't been resolved. And if they are not, then something has changed such that it has been resolved, or certainly its manifestations have been resolved. So that's just one other thing about how there's this kind of pervasive kind of view about conflict resolution having to mean agreement, that even in some mediation services there are these kind of categorizations of outcomes, rather than, as I would say, more appropriate for a client-led process, that reference is made to the participants themselves to decide whether it's been resolved or not. So that basically, I mean, this is what I always say to referrers: if you want to know how it's gone, it's not for me to say, it's for them to say, because it's their difficulty. So they're the ones who will give the best information about whether the situation has been resolved or improved, etc., rather than me. Because you could say, well, I'll always say it's resolved because I'm the mediator. I mean, it risks there being a conflict of interest to ask me what the outcome is. But it's unnecessary anyway, because you can't kind of box it and say, oh, settlement, partial settlement, or no settlement, as if that actually represents anything significant. And I kind of want to kind of re-emphasize that, because there's that kind of famous time when I've forgotten his name, it'll come to me in a minute, but the guy who came back from Hitler with a piece of paper saying, I have an agreement from him. I was going to say Chamberlain, but I can't remember if that's right. And he said there's an agreement, but there clearly wasn't. So a piece of paper doesn't prove anything. What matters is what happens afterwards. And there is this delusion that because there's a piece of paper, it's going to dictate what happens afterwards, but it won't. What happens afterwards is what happens afterwards, whether it's written down on a piece of paper or not. So I think it was Neville Chamberlain, wasn't it? My apologies if I've got that wrong, to anybody, to Neville Chamberlain and anybody else who's much more historically updated than me, but I think it was Neville Chamberlain. But in other situations as well, the piece of paper doesn't matter. What matters is what happens afterwards. If it happens to be written down on a piece of paper, an intended way forward, great, because that's what hopefully the participants have decided upon. But if it's not decided by the participants, the chances are it's not going to be a useful piece of paper afterwards anyway, because they're not going to be able to stick to it because they didn't create it. And it will have happened based on this kind of delusion that agreement is the indicator of conflict resolution, whereas it's actually incidental. It's not required for conflict to be resolved. Okay, the other thing I was going to say about this, or I mentioned just now, was the idea that conflict resolution, it's like conflict dissolution. And what I mean by that, the reason I use that phrase quite often to describe conflict resolution, is that for people involved in conflict, if it is genuinely resolved, it's as if it's dissolved, as if you don't really notice it's there anymore. It's like what was a problem is no longer a problem anymore. So it's one of these things where, for me, and I don't necessarily mean that all conflicts reach this stage, but if a conflict is genuinely resolved, you just kind of really don't think about it anymore. It's gone. It's in the past. Um, uh, at the time, it might be very intense, but you realise afterwards, after it's resolved, that actually you haven't thought about the problem for months or years, and probably never will again in the future. You might kind of almost sometimes remember, oh yeah, I had a problem with that, didn't I, once? And now you don't feel it anymore. That to me is genuine resolution. Um, and as I say, I don't necessarily mean that all conflicts we ever have get resolved in that way. Sometimes they are things that actually we kind of just can't deal with because circumstances mean we can't, but it's just kind of there, potentially coming back again at some stage sometimes. But we manage that on a kind of daily basis in some situations. Um, but actually, there can also be genuinely situations where it's just as if it's dissolved away and you don't even notice it anymore. Um, and for me, that is ultimately conflict resolution. The sense that what was a problem is no longer a problem. And really, when you think about just our daily interactions, very often we will have daily interactions with people. In a particular moment, there might be a sense of, oh dear, there's a problem, but we manage to resolve it so quickly that actually probably 10 minutes later we've forgotten about it. So we're actually very good at resolving conflicts, and again, without having to have agreements about everything, we're actually very good at resolving conflict, but we're so good that we actually forget about it very soon afterwards. And I would ask, if that's kind of maybe a challenge to you, me saying that, I would ask you to just think, well, just think every day, did you turn up? Maybe someone didn't do something that you were expecting, but it got sorted. And are you then still thinking about it? Um, I mean, it would only be if it repeatedly doesn't get done and there's some kind of problem that means it continuously won't get done, that you'll be having a sense that there's an unresolved conflict there. But the chances are something didn't get done, it got done, and you've forgotten about it. You've forgot it even happened. I mean, I often talk about the idea of moving about on the tube in London. You walk towards thousands of people coming towards you. Do we walk up to them all and say, get out my way? No, we actually say, or do they do that to us? No, we just kind of move past. We forget that it was ever a potential kind of difficulty. But there can be sometimes people who do think, get out my way, in which case they tend to have a kind of a more lingering challenge about it. Oh, all these people in my way, God, and then they'll talk about it when they turn up at the work meeting, say, oh, I had to do this, and they're still carrying it. So for them, the conflict isn't unresolved. But actually, most of the time, we do just kind of walk through the tube, if you live in London or wherever, walk through the crowds, we dodge and weave, etc. Maybe a little bit of a challenge every now and then, but we've forgotten about it, 10 minutes later. So just in simple things like that, we resolve a potential conflict and we move past it. And in more significant conflicts, we can often do it as well, but we don't need agreement every time for it to happen. It's only in certain situations that we might ever think that agreement, particularly a written agreement, is necessary. Much of the time it's just about us coming to a different understanding either the other person or indeed of ourselves. And so that's probably the final example I just want to talk about, is sometimes that we can think that before we can move on with something, we've got to have agreement with someone over something. But at the same time, we might think, but that's never going to happen. But actually, sometimes we can come to an understanding that we don't need that agreement, and we're making that as an expectation to be a problem that obstructs us from moving forward. So my example about that was more what happened once in a conflict coaching session I was doing with someone, and this person was concerned about not being able to see their child, or their teenage child. I'm not going to identify the gender because obviously I always want to maximize the confidentiality of things, but they were concerned about not being able to see their teenage child, and they saw the mother of this person to be the kind of main obstacle to that, and they had all sorts of labels for the person. They're narcissistic, they're deliberately vindictive, and all these kinds of different descriptions of their ex-partner about the reasons why they weren't able to see their teenager. And as we talked through the difficulty, what they came to realize was that rather than have to go through their ex-partner, that actually, because their child was a teenager now, and they already had kind of mobile contact, and indeed they realized they had once met with them without any kind of need to go via the ex-partner, because this person was their child was now 17 or 18. They were able to make kind of individual arrangements with them. That actually they didn't need to actually go via the ex-partner anymore. They were moving towards becoming an adult, and they were able to make their own arrangements. So the person came to a realization: I don't have to agree or deal with any of this with my ex-partner now. In the past, maybe, and they got so used to the idea they had to, but never been very successful at doing so. But they realised now that the situation had changed, and they didn't need that anymore. So this idea they had to get agreement with the ex-partner now fell away. So they could resolve their difficulty without their ex-partner being a problem for them to have to, someone they had to have an agreement with. So there are often ways in which what we want, we see a person as the obstacle to that, and we see the need for them to agree with us or our point of view as necessary before we can move forward. But actually, in many, many situations, we don't need that at all. We can just make our own arrangements to fulfill what we're wanting. Even as I speak, I can think of another one. I had a very brief, it wasn't even a formal session, but a discussion with someone once who came to me and said, I've got this kind of, because I'd given a talk about conflict resolution and mediation. They said, I've got this problem with this situation at work, and there's this person I need to get some data from, and no matter what I do, I just can't get it from them. And I didn't have any idea how they might do it, but I just said, what would their reason be for giving you that data? What's their involvement in your situation? Just really to explore it. And the person just suddenly came to a realization, well, actually, they're in an entirely different department. They've got no reason to kind of spend time doing what I might want them to do. They've probably got other things on their plate. And this person then kind of came to a realization, actually, I don't really even need to go via them. I could go via somebody else who's much more likely to be able to provide it for me. And they kind of said, oh, thanks. And it's like, well, I didn't say anything. I just asked them a question. And so again, we think we've got to kind of establish agreements with people about certain things. And then when we can't, we think, oh, goodness, that means we're stuck. But actually, often we don't need agreement with someone. We can actually take our own steps to kind of find the answers to things ourselves anyway. So this is just another way in which we kind of become focused on the idea we need somebody else to see things the way we do and to agree with that thing and to have the same expectations as us about a certain thing. when actually often we don't need that. We disempower ourselves by making ourselves reliant on the agreement of somebody else before we can go on and do things for ourselves. There may be some situations where it is necessary, in line management situations, etc. But in other situations, sometimes we think we do and we don't. So as I say, I know I come to an end there, but I just kind of want to um, kind of just sum up this idea that um, that conflict resolution is about agreement, and I would say very strongly it's not. It's about just creating what works for us, and that may not mean agreement, but it may mean agreement, but it's not a requirement. So the focus needs to be on conflict resolution, which is usually about being able to respectfully and creatively disagree with someone. It's also about being open to having a different understanding of someone than we perhaps previously had. It's also about seeing that we don't often need to have people's agreement to something before we can go forward with what we want to do, and that sometimes we spend more energy demonizing a particular individual because we think they should agree with us and give us their kind of permission before we go forward, when actually they may not kind of have a view one way or the other about it. Um, and that often we don't need that agreement before we go forward. And as I say, we may not. There might be some situations where it's essential, but what I mean is, have we questioned that? Have we looked into, is it essential that I have this person's agreement, or am I making them kind of an unnecessary obstacle to me being able to resolve this difficulty for myself? Um, and so, yeah, I'll bring it to an end there, just to say, please question if you think, or if you're told, or if in mediation it's suggested that you have to have agreement before you can resolve a conflict, because it just isn't the case. That conflict resolution doesn't have to be about agreement, but agreement may be a side effect of it, but it's not necessary for a conflict to be resolved and dissolved. So I hope that hasn't been too kind of rambling. I hope you found it useful and interesting. As always, please like and share and subscribe, or rate if it's on the podcast what it is I've said. Please tell me if you've got other thoughts about other things you'd like me to discuss. Please subscribe if I haven't said that already. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'll keep them coming if people keep watching and listening. So have a good day. I'll do another one soon. Thanks very much. Bye bye.